Hello, Valerie from BabyWiseMom.com talking with you today all about the basics of the eat portion of the eat, wake, sleep cycle found in Babywise and many other popular parenting baby schedule books. The eat portion of this routine is super vital to getting your baby to sleep, and it's often overlooked because it's just the eat. Everyone wants to focus in on sleep, 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 but you need to address the eat in order to attain the sleep. Hello, if you're new here, my name is Valerie. I am the mother to 4 children, ranging in age currently from 8 to 15 years old. I have been blogging at babywisemom.com since 2007, and I love helping parents love parenthood, and a big part of that is getting great sleep. So let's discuss how to get there. And before we go any further, make sure you like this video and subscribe to my channel. In this video, we are going to talk about 8 different facets that you need to focus on for the eat portion of your baby's day. The first one is to feed at consistent intervals and consistent times each day. One very important step in achieving this is to start each day at the same time. You can do this within a 30-minute window. I know it can be hard when you've been up with a baby in the night to wake a baby up at 7 or 7:30 a.m., but you need to pick your start time and stick with it. So if you're hoping that ultimately once your baby is sleeping through the night, that your baby will wake up at 7:30, then start at 7:30 each day. You can, like I said, have a 30-minute flex, but that means it may be 7:15 to 7:45 or 7 to 7:30 or 7:30 to 8. And I will also say that the closer you stay to that precise time, the sooner you will see the results you are hoping for. Initially, with a baby, with a newborn, you will have feedings every 2.5 to 3 hours. As your baby gets older, you will consistently move that time back. Some babies will just jump to longer intervals. Some will kind of slowly get longer intervals, but you will eventually get to eating every 4 hours. And if you want to know more about the 4-hour schedule, I have a video about that as well as a blog post. What you are aiming to do with this very consistent feeding times each day is to establish hunger patterns so that your baby is hungry at these times. Just like if you eat at the same times every day, your body gets hungry at the same times every day. If you don't, then you may be hungry sporadically. And that same thing is true for your baby, which can mean hunger in the middle of the night instead of hunger at regular intervals through the day. One example of this is with my middle schoolers. They often eat lunch around 10:30 in the morning. So on Saturdays, they're hungry at 10:30 in the morning for lunch. They're ready for lunch at 10:30, which for most of us, we don't really think of 10:30 as lunchtime. So because they're eating at 10:30 5 days a week, they're hungry at 10:30 those other 2 days of the week. So just like a middle schooler, your baby will be hungry at consistent times if your baby is eating at consistent times. The next important thing to focus in on when you are doing an eat, wake, sleep pattern with the eat portion is, yes, you will wake a sleeping baby. So yes, if your baby is still sleeping from a nap when it's time to eat, you wake your baby up. And yes, in the morning, if your baby is still sleeping when it's time to take that first feeding of the day, you wake your baby up. The third thing to focus on with your eat portion of your day is to keep your baby awake during feedings. That sounds easy. That sounds simple until you actually try it with a newborn. It is so hard to keep newborns awake. Newborns are sleepy, and they want to sleep a lot. Let me assure you that napping during a feeding will interfere with regular naps. So if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Little power naps here and there can make it so you're not as tired. So if your baby is taking a little power nap during the feeding time, then when it comes time for nap time, your baby probably either isn't going to be tired enough to fall asleep or tired enough to stay asleep. You want your baby to take a full feeding. If your baby needs 4 ounces, you don't want your baby taking 2 ounces or 3 ounces or even 3.5 ounces and then falling asleep or just stopping. So what are some tips for keeping your baby awake? Let's talk about some basic ways to keep a sleepy baby awake during feedings. And I do have a blog post about this, so be sure to check that out if you need to learn more. One thing to do is to just rub your baby. Rub that shoulder, rub your baby's feet, tickle your baby's feet, rub the back, rub your baby's hand. Just keep that physical stimulation so that your baby will stay awake. You can also move your baby up to a sitting position for a moment or two to get your baby to wake up. Babies are kind of like those little baby dolls where you sit up and the eyes open. So that's a good tip. You can also use a cool rag to help keep your baby awake. You can talk to your baby, sing to your baby. Sometimes it helps if you change your baby's diaper halfway through. So if you're breastfeeding, you feed one side, change the diaper, feed the second side. If you're bottle feeding and say you're feeding 4 ounces, then you feed 2 ounces and then change baby's diaper and then feed the other 2 ounces. Diaper changes really wake babies up because it's a lot of coldness and wetness and exposure. So it's a really great way to get your baby to just wake right back up. And along all those things, you can also burp your baby. So you're sitting your baby up, working on burping, and then getting back to it. You can also change your baby's position. So you might switch sides that you're breastfeeding, or if you're bottle feeding, you may change how your baby is positioned for the feed, or breastfeeding, you can change the position for the feed. I mentioned that your baby needs full feeds, and that is our next focus point for your eat, is to make sure your baby is getting full feeds. So let's talk about that in greater detail. You want your baby to take full feedings so that your baby can make it to the next feed. Remember talking about those feeding intervals. If we're feeding every 2.5 hours, we want to make sure baby gets a full feeding so that your baby can make it 2.5 hours until the next feeding. With a newborn, you typically take 20 to 40 minutes to eat. And as time goes on, your baby will get faster. So what are some signs that your baby is done eating? Let's talk about them. One is that your baby unlatches and will not reattach. So that can be with breastfeeding or bottle feeding. Another sign is that your baby will open up the hands and relax the body. You may notice that your baby will keep his little hands in a fist, and then once he's done feeding, usually those hands will relax. Another sign is your baby will turn away from the milk source. And then of course another thing to pay attention to is if the breast is empty or the bottle is empty. That's an excellent sign that baby is done. You will also notice baby is done when baby is very easily distracted from feeding. As you're wondering if your baby is getting full feedings or not, make sure you pay attention to your baby's growth patterns over time. You want that growth curve to stay the same over time. Pay attention to diaper output. Make sure it stays the same and regular and is consistent. That's with both wet and dirty diapers. Do note that bowel movement patterns do change over time as your baby gets older. And then also pay attention to your baby's disposition. If your baby is content and happy during the playtime that happens after this eat portion, then your baby likely got a full feeding. And if your baby is making it from that feeding until the next scheduled feeding, then you know baby's getting a full feeding. Let's pause for a moment to make sure everyone understands how to calculate time between feedings. So if you're feeding at 7 a.m. and you're going 3 hours between feedings, then your next feeding will be 10 a.m. So you calculate from the start of one feeding to the start of the next feeding. That's how you calculate feeding times. Our fifth important thing to note when it comes to your eat portion of your eat, wake, sleep cycle, the fifth thing to take note of when focusing in on the eat portion of your eat, wake, sleep cycle is to feed more often when needed. Babywise is parent-directed. That means the parent decides. So if you notice that your baby is hungry before the scheduled feeding time, you absolutely feed your hungry baby. This will happen during a growth spurt, and I do have a video and a blog post all about growth spurts if you need more details on that. But during a growth spurt, your baby will eat often every 2 hours, so you'll be feeding a lot more often. Sometimes you may find you're feeding your baby more often and you'll come to realize you have a low milk supply, or there's a medical issue that either you or your baby have. Sometimes there can be feeding issues because of a lip tie or a tongue tie that baby has. So always feed your baby sooner than what you've planned on, even if it's not following your plans, but you're feeding your baby when hungry. You also can have scheduled and planned times of day that you feed more often than the typical 2.5 hours. This is especially true if you're doing cluster feeding in the evening, which is feeding every 2 hours to kind of top baby up to hope baby will sleep longer through the night, and or for a dream feed, which is a feeding around 10:30 p.m. And I do have a video and a blog post all about the dream feed. And I have a blog post all about cluster feeding. The sixth thing to know is that you absolutely can succeed with your eat, wake, sleep cycle, whether you're breastfeeding or bottle feeding with formula or pumped breast milk. Some people worry that it's not going to work with breastfeeding, and it absolutely does. I did it with 4 babies, and there are so many mothers out there who did it. So you can make it work no matter what method of feeding you are using. The 7th point to focus in on is that you do not want to feed your baby to sleep. You want your baby to learn to fall asleep independently. That's why we have an eat, wake, sleep cycle. So we're not letting baby fall asleep while eating. That helps ensure we get those full feedings. And then we have some measure of playtime, and that varies greatly depending on how old your baby is. And then we do sleep. If you're looking for a great way to help your baby learn to sleep independently, I highly recommend the 4 S's, and I have a video and blog post about that. With that said, there can be exceptions. For example, some babies have a witching hour in the evening, and during a witching hour, you absolutely can feed your baby to sleep if you need to, which you might need to. And if you think you might have some witching hour going on with your newborn to 3-4 month old baby, be sure to see my blog post about the witching hour. Our final facet to focus in on is to make sure you maintain this eat, wake, sleep cycle even after you start solid foods. Sometimes people will start solids and they will feed their baby a liquid feeding at 7 a.m. and then they will do a solid feeding at 9 a.m. and then a liquid feeding at 11 a.m. And so suddenly you've taken your baby to a 2-hour feeding schedule, where your newborn was feeding every 2.5 to 3 hours, and then eventually on liquid feedings, your baby was doing every 4 hours, and then you introduce solids and you're feeding every 2 hours. You want to make sure you keep that eat, wake, sleep cycle, not eat, play, eat, sleep cycle. So liquid feeding followed very soon with the solid feeding, then you play, then you sleep. Okay, that wraps up our 8 points on things to focus on with the eat portion of your eat, wake, sleep cycle. If you have any questions, always feel free to drop them in the comments and I will answer them for you. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.